This episode of Quiltmakers Lessons in Creativity is brought to you by FOF, Perfection Starts Here, and Moda, producer of quilting fabric and home of the fabric precuts. Welcome to Quiltmakers Lessons in Creativity. I'm Jenny K. Parks, your host. For more about me, you can check out my website, jennykquilts.com. Our inspiration for this series is Zippity Doo Dah by Leanna Spanner, and it's available in the January-February 2017 edition of Quiltmakers. So check it out. We're using that for our inspiration for the whole series. Today we're going to start with talking about foundation piecing. This is one of the blocks that you've done that is in the pattern. It's a simple square and a square block, very classic, but I wanted to show you how to do the foundation piecing with it. Partly because I think it's good to start with an easy block, a block you know, when you're learning a new technique. So we're just going to jump into this here. All right, foundation piecing, the basic theory is this. You're securing your fabric to a foundation, so you have increased accuracy and stability, and it's a good way to take care of little points and little corners. It's a really good technique. Now I want you to be patient with yourself too if you've never foundation pieced at all, because it's a bit upside down and backwards from how quilters usually think about stuff. I was teaching a class a while back with foundation piecing, and one of the ladies, she felt like she couldn't get it, and she got very upset with herself, and I'm thinking, no. You're learning new techniques. You're training your brain to do something new and different that it never has done before. So be patient. I'm going to go through this slowly. We'll take it step by step, and you can rewind and look at what you need to. But like I said, starting out with a block you know that's going to be simple is a good way to get going. All right, so here is our foundation that we're using. People also use muslin or freezer paper. My favorite is the freezer paper technique, but we're just going to use a plain paper foundation for this. Here is my center, and I cut it out. You notice I fussy cut it because I wanted to make the most out of this little flower here. I cut it also a little bit smaller. In the directions, the block, we cut the whole block and we do a square and a square stitch and flip technique. But for here, you don't need as much fabric to start with. So I just cut this smaller, and I know that it's going to be big enough to cover my center part. Oh, and before we get too far, I do a little prep work on my pattern. Let me show you what I do. Because this is the actual outline of how we want the block to look, right? Here's my preparations that I do. I take this ruler here, and I draw. Whoops, I shifted a little bit. Hang on there. Be careful. All right. Hold it nice and secure. And then I'm going to go on both sides nice and carefully. What this does is this tells me where my 1/4 inch seam allowance will end. So for this piece here, that's the end of my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Those lines are going to be a good cue for you to figure stuff out. And notice I took them past the borders here, because when I sew this, I'm going to sew far across the edges because I don't want to cut myself short. I don't want to unfold the block and then realize, oh, I didn't meet at the corner, darn, and I have to go back and fix that. So sewing a little bit past that helps me to be more accurate there. So let me put the last few on, line up this seam guide, and you can tell from the red marks on it that I use it a lot. Either side. And I want you guys to see it too. I want you to have a good frame of reference of how this all works together. Now I did my sample here for you, and I did it in pencil. And the pencil, for me, when I was piecing this block, it was harder to see. So that's why I've done it with the red, and I think that's what I would continue to do it with the red all the time. All right, so I'm going to flip my paper over, because what's going to happen is I'm going to adhere stuff to the back. That's the upside down and backwards part that I was talking about. So I flip my paper over. And having a good light source is really great. If you had a light box or holding it up to the window so that I can see through it and see where to line it up, that works really well. I'm going to hold it up here. And I can kind of see where my lines come through. And you may have to do a little flipping and adjusting as we go, and that's pretty good. And then I'm going to use my hero, glue stick. And I'm just going to glue stick this down really well. And the reason why I use glue stick instead of, say, pinning it, because pins, especially when you're moving this around and folding and changing directions and stuff, you can end up poking yourself. They can end up being more of a pain than they're actually worth. So glue stick, I think, is a good choice. I've also tried tape, but then you have to hassle with the tape. So I put that glue stick on there and just smooth it out real nice. And it's just regular washable school glue, no biggie. All right, so now I need to put my next one. With foundation piecing, they'll have you start with, usually they'll say number 1 on it, and then we'll go 2, 3, 4, 5, and continue around. And it's sort of like paint by number. You sew by number. So I'm going to take my next piece. I'm going to lay it on here. And I'm going to make sure, as I look through, that my piece covers that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I've already cut it. I've already figured out how big this needs to be to make sure I can cover the corners. It may take a little bit of trial and error to get it at the exact spot, but this works really well. Let me line that up. All right, now, here comes the tricky part. I've got it all lined up. I'm going to come over here to my machine. And I'm going to sew through the paper, thereby securing it to the foundation. And make sure it's not stuck underneath. And I'm using the 1/4 inch foot that does not have a flange. It has nothing sticking down to hold the fabric in line, so I'm going to be plenty free to move as I need to move. And I'm going to stitch right on that line. And it's going to be great. So you see those, I'm sure you've seen them, the quilting, the blocks that have really sharp, fine points, and they're really tiny. This is how they do it, foundation piecing. All right. Now all we're going to do is flatten it out, and I'm going to glue stick it into place. Before I do, I want to double check that I've covered the block that I need to. Ha, and I have. So I'm just going to put some glue stick down there. Oh, wait, I forgot one thing. Oh, this is really important. Notice how this may look a little bit longer. The seam allowance is not the size that you would expect it to be. I have fixed that. I forgot to do that part. What I like to do is after I've stitched it, then you take one of these guys here. It has a little lip under here that marks the 1/4 inch mark right there. And so that kind of hooks onto the top of the template, at the top of the paper foundation. And then I can trim off that extra so I have exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's sticking to the paper a little bit because I got ahead of myself. But that's all right. This down and press. Well, finger press. Push into place there. I'm going to put a little bit more glue on there because I don't want those corners to get in the way. All right. Now we do the next side. Just keep working your way around. And I'm going to double check that it's lined up nicely. And I can see through the light here that I have all around me. All right, beautiful. I'm going to turn it over and stitch again. It is kind of tricky sometimes to hold it into place while you're doing it. That may be like, if I'm going to make a mistake, that's going to be the spot where I get something folded over. While I'm saying that, I'm going to double check there. I might stitch a fold in it or something like that. And I remember I was doing that in a class, and I unfolded it, and there was I turned it over, there was this big fold in there, and one of the students in the class goes, "Oh, you do make mistakes." I'm like, oh yeah, That is not a problem for me. I don't have to intentionally try to do that at all. It happens entirely naturally. Okay, so before I glue stick, I'm going to fold back. Now you see I've stitched, right? You see I've stitched further along these lines. So I may have to rip just a little bit off of the foundation to get an accurate cut, but that's okay. I would rather have to rip out just a tiny bit like that to get to the fold than have to go back and recreate the whole thing. Line up the ruler here. And it's all right to trim off this part right here. Just trim it off. Kind of when you're doing this, don't worry too much of like, oh, is this part right or that part right? Trust the foundation. If you follow the steps, trust the foundation that it's going to work. Flip that over. There we go. It's all covered. Yay! Now I glue. Oh, got some on my finger. And just press it into shape. All right, moving on down to the next one here. Line it up. Flip it over. Come here to the machine and make sure that I'm not folding anything. It feels like it wants to fold on me. I'm not going to let that happen. And you're really just following a line. Sometimes it's easier to follow that line than it is to do it other ways. I find following that line visually is really easy for me. There's my line that I sewed. Now I need to fold it back. Now some people will use a smaller stitch count. So mine's set at 2.5. I could make it a smaller stitch, thereby perforating the paper more to make it easier to remove, but it's an option for you. Some people will also switch to a different kind of needle and find they have better results. I'm just using my regular default stuff that I would use for everyday piecing. Put this into place. Oh, I just love it when a block comes together and everything looks good. All right, last one. I'm pretty sure it's going to fit right there. And I can see and center that. Flip this over and go to my machine. So when you're sewing, especially when you're following a line like this, it's a good idea to start to train your eye to follow further ahead of where your needle is. And to watch what you're doing there. To follow further ahead of where your needle is, because then you can correct issues before you stitch them. And I think that's kind of a bonus. You can head any problems off at the pass. All right, last one. So you can see this is a great technique for using up lots of little scraps. This is a fun block to try it on. Oh, let me make sure I'm getting my fold real well. And trim off all those extras. Oops. There we go. All right, now we flip it over and glue that into place. So put that glue stick on there and fold it into place. Now, what we need to think about is cutting it down to size. And we'll just go ahead and trim on these outside edges. I love being able to have on my ruler a 1/4 inch mark that will show, so I can line it up on the outside edge and on the 1/4 inch. I think that is, just one more thing to make sure I'm doing it right. I need all the help I can get. Just keep turning it around. Now you might be very excited to remove the paper right after you trim this to take it off. Don't, because the theory is that you need to keep it all stabilized and secure to the foundation until it's secured somewhere else in the quilt or somewhere else in the block, in the thing that you're making. You want it all to be secured before you trim it. So if I was going to join these two together, I could join it there, and if I like put sashing around it or something like that and called that good, then I could take off all the paper foundation. But you can see how it's starting to rip up a little bit. That's just the same thing you're going to do. Just sit down, put on Netflix or something, and just rip off the foundation piecing once you've got it all put together. All right, so that's it. A simple overview for foundation piecing. In the next episode, we're going to talk about Block Y and taking advantage of striped fabrics. You're not going to want to miss it. I'll see you there. This episode of Quiltmakers Lessons in Creativity is brought to you by FOF, Perfection Starts Here, and Moda, producer of quilting fabric and home of the fabric pre-cuts.